What did the people want to do to Gideon, and why did he refuse? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Judges 8 verses 22 to 35, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Judges 8 verse 22, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges chapter 8, beginning at verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Then Gideon said to them, "I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder." For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So they answered, "We will gladly give them." And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes, which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. Then Gideon made it into an ephod, and set it up in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so they lifted their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Then Jerubbaal the son of Joash went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons, who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon the son of Joash died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. Gideon and his men, by the power of the Lord, had defeated the Midianites. Today's reading confirms what we said at the end of the last lesson, which was that the Midianites as a people were so decimated that, although they still existed, they did not exist as a power that could afflict Israel like they did in Judges going forward. In fact, we're only going to read of them again a few more times in passing as we continue our walk through the Bible. With Israel victorious and finally set free from the Midianites, it is only natural that Israel wanted to make Gideon their king. Now you might think, but if Gideon and Deborah were largely contemporary, why wouldn't Israel want to make Deborah their queen, as she had, through God and Barak's army, delivered Israel from the Canaanites? Well, let's consider what type of society that Israel existed in here. It was a patriarchal society. Having a woman judge was peculiar, and we mentioned such in our look at Deborah. It was only because of a lack of male leadership that God raised up a faithful woman to judge Israel in the first place. Thus, if having a female judge was peculiar, so too would having a female monarch. No, assuming that Gideon and Deborah were contemporary, and I believe the evidence points to the fact that they were, it would make sense, based on the fact that Gideon is a male, and the fact that his victory was likely the most recent, that Israel would want to make him a king. But not only did they want to make Gideon a king, Israel wanted to set up Gideon's family as a kingly dynasty. Gideon refused on all counts. Why? Well, we've seen throughout that Gideon was a humble man. Sometimes this humility led to a weakness in faith in God, but since this battle with the Midianites, Gideon's faith in God was strong. But since his faith was strong, Gideon knew why he was successful. It was because of God. Therefore, Gideon did the right thing and said that he wouldn't rule over them. The Lord would. In doing this, Gideon not only put himself in the proper place and the Lord in the proper place, but it should have had the effect of bringing Israel back to God for good. But alas, even though Gideon was a man of faith are not perfect. Instead of being king, Gideon asked the people to give him some of the expensive spoils from the war with the Midianites, and from it, Gideon made an ephod. From everything I can gather, it is likely this ephod resembled the ephod that the high priest would wear, the one that would contain the Urim and the Thummim, that which was used by the high priest to reveal the will of God. Now, why would Gideon do this? We're not told. Perhaps his relationship with Ephraim was such that he didn't want to travel to Shiloh and talk with the high priest to learn the will of God. Perhaps it's because he thought that since God had personally appeared to him, something we had not seen since the days of Moses and Joshua, that he needed this as a sign that God was speaking through him. Or perhaps it was simply meant to be a sign that God had spoken through Gideon and delivered Israel, and this was to be a memorial for that. Whatever the case, this ephod was made, it was set up by Gideon, and it became a snare to Gideon, his family, and the people, for Israel worshipped it. Now the passage doesn't say that Gideon worshipped it, but even if he didn't, he shouldn't have made it, and by making it, it did lead Israel and possibly his family down the road to idolatry, even if this idolatry was worship of the true God. God doesn't desire idol worship even of himself. This is yet another warning in Scripture to us about religious images, whether they be crosses, statues, paintings, or whatever. God doesn't desire these as part of our worship, and they can become snares to us and our families, which can lead us down the road to idolatry. As for Gideon himself, Judges says that he had 70 sons, for he had many wives. Let's not think that having multiple wives was God's design for marriage, for Jesus would say in Matthew 19 that it was not. However, God suffered the people at this time, allowing them to have multiple wives and suffer the consequences for that decision. He does not suffer men and women in this regard today. We must follow God's teaching found in the New Testament regarding marriage, which is generally one man married to one woman until death parts them. One of Gideon's sons of note will be Abimelech. Abimelech was born of one of Gideon's concubines from Shechem, and we'll meet him in chapter 9. Overall, Gideon lived to a good old age. What age exactly we do not know, and the land had rest from oppression for 40 years. This means that according to our timeline, when we take up with chapter 9, it will be approximately 1144 BC. After the death of Gideon, Israel fell back into their regular pattern, again going back to idolatry. Now, during the days of Gideon, they had been exposed to worshiping Gideon's ephod. However, after Gideon's death, they returned to the Baal worship they had been doing before the days of Gideon. And Gideon's family, the ones that Israel earlier wanted to make their royal family, they didn't show kindness to them either, showing us that our memory is short and fades, especially as the years pass by. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Judges chapter 9, verses 1 to 6, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.